So I'm Geoff Anders from Leverage Research. My co-organizers, we have Adam Marblestone and Jose Luis Ricon from the unofficial Adam and Jose Scientific Road Mapping Consortium. And we have Larissa Hesketh-Rowe, also from Leverage Research. So the last decade, we've seen a couple different narratives about technological progress and about scientific progress. On one hand, you have the narrative of singularity, where things are just going faster and faster, and soon we're not even going to be able to tell what's happening anymore. On the other hand, you have the narrative of stagnation, where apart from lots of advances in information technology, we're really not making much progress at all. Well, so I was hanging out on Twitter, and I saw there was a guy posting some interesting, smart things about science. This is Jose. So I sent him a message and said, hey, you want to talk about science and et cetera? And Jose, this was in December, Jose basically just outlined the thing I just said about stagnation and singularity, and we agreed that really the thing we should be trying to do is figure out how much progress is actually being made in each of the different areas, and then figure out how we can push things forward. And so I came back to Jose with the proposal that we do a workshop devoted to this topic. And this sort of dovetails nicely with our work at Leverage Research. We're currently studying the history of science because we believe that there are lessons that can be drawn from the history of successful sciences that could help us make progress, especially with nascent or struggling fields today. And so while that doesn't sort of cover all of sort of science and technology, I mean, actually our sort of goals are larger. I mean, we are interested in finding any place really where advancing science and technology could be helpful, looking for the points of highest leverage, hence the name. And so this really seemed like a sort of perfect opportunity. And then it turned out that Jose had an interest in scientific road mapping. He suggested that we bring in Adam Marblestone, also an interest in scientific road mapping. And that's not exactly the same thing as identifying bottlenecks. So with scientific road mapping, you're essentially trying to create a sequence of points that you go through in the process of developing some science or technology. It's nevertheless very closely related to this idea of figuring out, well, how much progress is really being made? What are the bottlenecks? How can we defeat those? So we got to thinking, all right, well, if we were going to do a workshop like this, then who should attend? It seemed like the sort of thinking about the bottlenecks in the different fields calls for a sort of, I mean, it's complicated. It's a bunch of different attributes. I mean, you need the people, I mean, analyzing an entire field or even subfield, it's an abstract activity. So you need the people to be able to think abstractly. But if it's just abstract thinking, then it's pretty likely people will be too far away from ground level implementational details. And so you really need people who are both abstract and concrete. And then when you think about what the bottlenecks are in different areas, in some cases, maybe it's just, a technical bottleneck. And there aren't really any social or institutional factors involved. But there's sort of a selection effect where, you think if it's just technical, then maybe it's more likely we'd actually have solved it. So really we expected that the bottlenecks in a lot of cases would involve some mixture of technical barriers and social and institutional barriers. And then thinking about those, it's sort of two very different modes of thought. It's like you need to be able to think about the actual object level thing that you're studying, but you also need to think about the people and think about the institutions. And then since we were going to do a bunch of bottleneck analyses sort of all together, it also seemed like you wanted people who were a bit more generalists. Like you don't need to be a total, complete generalist. That's certainly very hard nowadays. But it seemed like you'd want people who at least were very interested in thinking about a whole bunch of different areas. So we made a list of those people who we knew, and here you are. Welcome. The next question is, okay, well, what areas should we look at? Right? I mean, the idea of identifying bottlenecks, like ostensibly you could look at really any area. And so partially we picked based on people who we knew or things we were working on, people who we knew were working on things like this. But we also decided to aim for a couple goals in the selection. One thing was I wanted to avoid sort of the most maybe political areas, and that's, in some way doing an analysis of the bottlenecks in an area may end up being sort of inherently political, because you're frequently talking about why a whole lot of people aren't making progress on something where they're supposed to be making progress and frequently are saying that they are. Nevertheless, we could sort of avoid certain hotspots, and so I don't know if I picked the right hotspots, but I decided for this one we were not going to do string theory and we were not going to do AI. Okay. It seems to be working out so far. But so then there's a question of, well, which ones should we do? And there it seemed like going for a mixture, looking for some things that are far future, some things that are near future, like right on the cusp of happening, and some things that are retro future, like the future we were promised that we didn't get, and why not? Also, because there's this sort of simultaneous technical and social institutional way of looking at these things, we wanted to pick areas that sort of seemed more likely to have technical barriers and areas that also seemed more likely to have social institutional barriers. So we'd be sort of examining the swath of things. And then we also just wanted a range of different topics and to include the social sciences. So this gives us our workshop. In terms of goals for the workshop, obviously, we have a great group of people here, and so there's lots to learn from each other. We sort of structured the workshop in a way to have a whole bunch of breaks where people can talk to each other. That's to sort of take advantage of that. We also there is a sort of goal that we're expecting to be top of mind, which is the goal of trying to actually concretely identify what are the bottlenecks in each of the specific areas that we're looking at. The way I've been sort of thinking about this, maybe it's a little too, centralized, maybe not, but I've been thinking sort of imagine you have a dashboard, and the dashboard has each of the areas on it, and then there's a question of what stage is each of the different areas or projects or initiatives at. Like maybe it's all ready to go, and the only thing that's necessary is funding. Maybe you've got the idea worked out, but there isn't a team to implement it. Maybe we don't yet have the ideas worked out and we need to figure out more what's really going on in an area. Or it could be we have the ideas, but we don't really have a strategy. And so it's hard to know what sort of team to look for because we really don't know how to address a given bottleneck. So you can think of that as one of the sort of the ground level goal for the workshop. There's also, a second goal is that we are developing basically a format here. So it's like bottleneck analysis. Well, what is that? Well, we don't entirely know. It's sort of very suggestive and people have lots of ideas. What we're hoping to do in part through the workshop is to develop this format so that we come to have a more concrete idea of what do good analyses like this look like. This is part of the reason when we were setting it up, we had to make a choice. How finished do we want the different analyses to be? And we decided, well, let's sort of aim for 80%. Okay, we don't know how hard it is to push the things all the way to 100%, and also we don't know how to think about this area in general. So let's go for 80%, and then it's part of the goal of the workshop to sort of try to push things closer to us actually understanding what's going on. But so we've got the specific areas, there's working on the format, and then coming, potentially out of successfully analyzing a number of different areas, a number of different people have suggested to us that this might produce something like a toolkit, or you could imagine we've identified 4 different major types of bottlenecks, and here's how you deal with, we've just identified a 5th, right? This is the sort of thing where maybe knowledge from one area would transfer to another area, and so that's something that we're hoping to keep our eyes open for. We've set up the workshop to sort of start off with the analyses. We have, we're going to do sessions of 2 presentations followed by a break and discussion, then 2 more, break and discussion, and so on. We're going to do this for the first day and a half. And then to finish out the second day, we're going to, we wanted to have a focus on, well, what are the next steps? And so this includes, like the way this all came together, we didn't exactly have a plan for what the next steps would be. We did imagine that a bunch of the analyses could be written up in some form, but in terms of where does this whole thing go, the answer is we don't know yet, and we're hoping to figure that out through this workshop. And so then, nearing the close of the workshop, we're then going to transition into talking about next steps, which will include next steps on specific projects. In addition to this, we have some great speakers. We have Peter Thiel's going to be giving a keynote at the end of today before dinner. Patrick Collison's going to open tomorrow, and then Tyler Cowan's going to finish off the workshop with a keynote before dinner tomorrow. And now I'd like to pass this over to Larissa. Larissa's going to talk a little bit about logistics, and then Jose is going to introduce our host and our first bottleneck talk, Blake Scholl.